be joined by Dr. Tim Rittman. Tim,
Hiya.
Tim is a senior research associate. And do you know what? You were awkward because you've got such a long job title.
It's a ridiculous job title, yeah.
You made me go on to. Do you know, I'm one of these people that hates things when they go onto 2 rows, and you were really hard to get onto 1 row.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Senior research associate and consultant neurologist at the University of Cambridge, but also Cambridge. Are you at the hospital as well, aren't you?
Yeah, so I spend part of my time as a neurologist. I've been in clinic all day today, actually. So it's a shame I haven't been able to see any of this because I've been in clinic.
Well, you can watch back.
I remember
to record at about 2 hours in. So we missed, but also, I think on the YouTube, I think it'll go live and stay in YouTube, and you can rewind it there.
So
you've been
part of what I do
as well.
Yeah.
I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Sana Suri. Have I said that right, Sana Suri?
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, who is an Alzheimer's Society Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. We've had a few people from Oxford today. Big up for Oxford. Yeah. We've got Oxford and Cambridge today, so this is a competition. Who is best?
This is.
I didn't realise that.
One right answer.
I should have done some preparation then, shouldn't I?
Who's gonna win? Could you virtually arm wrestle? No, I'm teasing. There is no competition amongst academia. So Tim, I'm going to come to you first. So tell us about your work. Introduce yourself.
So when I'm not in the clinics, I'm a researcher, so I'm an academic. So I work partly funded by the Cambridge Bioresource Centre here and the Centre for Parkinson's Plus syndrome. So I have sort of 2 bits to my work really. So the first bit is trying to understand some types of rare dementia, and the other is trying to use some of the sort of fancy imaging techniques that we have in research and try and take that to the clinic. So the 2 types of unusual dementias that I look at are called progressive supranuclear palsy, cortical basal degeneration. So we often think of dementia as sort of Alzheimer's disease of memory and things like that. In these diseases, it more affects movement, and it affects people in terms of their behaviour and sometimes their language and speech as well. So what I'm trying to do with these sort of brain pictures or brain images is try and work out how the diseases are travelling through the brain. So we know if we look at these diseases under a microscope, we can see this build-up of this protein that's called tau. And we know a fair bit about what happens to tau in a petri dish. And we're starting to understand what happens in a mouse. But actually then translating that up to a whole human brain is a real challenge. So we're trying to bridge that gap. We're using imaging. So sometimes I mainly use MRI scans. So that's magnetic resonance imaging, which is a sort of magnetic scan. It's a long tube that you go into. It's very noisy, but it gives you really nice, beautiful images of the brain. So we can look at the structure of the brain, which bits of the brain shrink away. But I'm also very interested in conversations within the brain, so what we call brain networks. So there's different conversations going on between brain regions, and you can build up all those conversations. You think about lots of people being on the phone to each other, a whole sort of network of telephone conversations. It's very similar in the brain. And you can look at how that changes in dementia. And we know that these sort of brain networks are sort of templates, if you like, for how the disease is spread through the brain. So when we look at where in the brain the disease pops up, it's very similar to these networks. But also we know that these networks can help stave off some of the symptoms. If you can organize your networks in an efficient way, it can stave off some of the symptoms of dementia. So I'm trying to understand those 2 things really. And the other part, we're sort of trying to use some of those sort of fancy imaging techniques that we're using to say, well, actually, if we can look at these brain networks or brain structure, can we use things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to actually give information to clinicians, to doctors like me in the clinic that we might not otherwise have, to help us with diagnosis and predicting what's going to happen to someone in the future with their dementia.
You'd expect that clever modelling and creating those kind of, well, as we all know, that as the brain's complex. I was just thinking about Elon Musk's latest news article last week. I think he's suddenly learning, isn't he? Rocket science is easier than brain science. So, I mean, how close do you think we are to being able to replicate some of those networks using artificial intelligence and machine learning, or are they just too dissimilar?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think trying to sort of replicate what the brain does on a computer is very challenging, because the brain works in lots of clever ways, and it doesn't really work in the same way as a computer. I mean, some people would argue the brain is just one big guessing machine, really. It makes a guess and then it sort of sees if it's right and then adjusts it a bit, and sort of goes back and sort of makes another guess and sees if that's right. That's very different to the way a computer works, which is sort of very precise and sort of digital. So people are trying to do that. I think we're much better at trying to actually use some of those artificial intelligence and machine learning methods to answer the questions that we've got, because when you've got a brain image, it's loads and loads of what we call little voxels. It's like taking your TV screen, and each little point on there is a point of the brain. That's a lot of data. And then if you take something like the UK Biobank, which we're looking at, which has got 40,000 people who've had brain scans in, that's a huge amount of data. So we need those kinds of fancy models actually to understand the data.
And being able to process that data all together and overlap those is where computers are great, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the way that artificial intelligence, machine learning is going, there's, we can answer questions which we just couldn't answer 10, 15 years ago. And what's great about working in imaging as well, I'm sure Sana will say the same, is that people are very collaborative and work together. So people have been able to put together these massive data sets from loads of different parts of the world. So rather than working on 10 people that you've recruited from your clinic, you're suddenly working on 1,000 people from lots of different centres around the world.
That's fascinating. And sorry, Sana, we'll come to you next. Tell us about your work.
Hi, Adam. Hi, Tim. Thanks very much for having me on today. So my work, well, I've just started my research group called the Heart and Brain Group in Oxford. So my research sort of does exactly what the group name says. I'm mainly interested in how the health of our heart in midlife, when we're about 40, 50, 60 years old, affects our brain and cognitive health when we get older. So, we've already heard from previous sessions today that there are certain lifestyle factors, such as having high blood pressure, having diabetes, high cholesterol, or being obese, doing low levels of exercise or smoking. In midlife, all of these things can affect the health of our heart, but we also know now that they increase our chances of getting dementia when we're older. And so my research uses a number of different brain imaging methods to understand what causes this heart-brain link in Alzheimer's disease particularly. And there are many sort of specific kinds of brain imaging methods that I use. So I'm most interested in methods that measure the blood flow to the brain. So because I think that this sort of link between heart health and brain health may lie within the amount of blood and the quality of blood that's supplied to the brain under different conditions. So I use a range of different brain imaging methods that can tell us different sort of complementary bits of information about blood flow to the brain.
Blood flow to the brain is that part something you're imaging at the same time?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm not specifically looking at sort of how the blood sort of changes in the blood system, but actually when we're looking at these what we call functional imaging, which is what we build up from these networks, actually we're looking at things indirectly there, and that directly measures blood flow. So when you're thinking hard about something and a bit of the brain is active, actually the blood gets diverted to that. And that's how actually we pick up the activity of the brain, because the blood gets diverted there. So yeah, it's, I think, I always say what's good for the heart's good for the brain. So
yeah,
I think it's a really important area, actually.
Yeah, that old adage is true. Just coming back to a point you made before, Tim, about looking at the reorganizing brain networks. And this has come up a few times before about the importance of continuing to learn and things like the brain training games and things like that. I mean, is this something that's been looked at as well there. I mean,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's something I'm really interested in looking at further, actually. And this comes back to this concept of like cognitive reserve. So what that means is if you're well educated, if you're a very social person, then your brain becomes a bit more resilient to dementia. We don't quite know why. My suspicion is actually it makes the brain networks a bit more efficient. So if your brain networks are more efficient, then you can withstand a bit more damage to the brain, if you like. So we know we sort of looked at this in some genetic forms of dementia. So it's an amazing study called the Genetic Fronto-temporal Initiative, run by some guys at UCL, which looks at people who have this genetic form of dementia. We can see that they lose brain volume, so they lose brain cells 10 years before they have symptoms. But actually, from what we've looked at, their brain networks stay pretty stable until they get symptoms. So my suspicion is actually this cognitive reserve, if you can build that up, makes your networks efficient, makes you more resilient to dementia. Whether you can then get that later on by brain training and things like that, I'm not so confident about, but it's possible. Yeah, who knows?
Well, I guess does it come back to this idea, as long as you're putting in more than you're taking out, perhaps. So if you can continue to try and learn as maybe it just slows down the progression rather than perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's not sort of conclusively proven yet, but I mean, people often ask me about, oh, if I learn a second language, will it stop me getting dementia? Well, I say, well, that's fine. Maybe, but don't learn it for the sake of stopping getting dementia. Do it because you want to learn a second language
just because it's interesting. Yeah. And Sana, so you say you're setting up an entirely new lab then. So what's the underlying this? I mean, what are you hoping to achieve through this new lab?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it sort of builds on what Tim was just talking about, the concept of cognitive reserve. So I'm interested in cerebrovascular reserve. And that's how much your body can sort of boost up its blood flow to the brain whenever the demands for blood in the brain start to increase. So we use this very specific kind of brain imaging to measure a proxy marker of vascular reserve called cerebrovascular reactivity. It's a bit of a mouthful, but really what we're doing is putting people into the scanner. They just got to lie in this bed. They wear a little face mask on and they breathe normal air that you would sort of normally breathe in the room. And then for small periods of time, we sort of slightly increase the amount of carbon dioxide that we deliver to them. And the reason we do that is we're trying to mimic the effects of light exercise. So the carbon dioxide acts as a sort of stress test to see how much your body can boost up the blood flow to the brain whenever the demand for energy in the brain increases. And we know that in people with Alzheimer's disease, this sort of compensation response is a little bit impaired. And so what I'm interested in and what we're going to be doing over the coming years is looking at whether people who are also at risk of Alzheimer's but don't show any symptoms yet, whether they also have changes in this carbon dioxide response while they're in the MRI scanner, and whether their blood flow is impaired in this area.
So that's just a normal scanning machine.
It's just a normal scanning machine that's fitted with a few extra tubes to supply air while you're in the scanner. And we're sort of also using another technique called ultrasound. And we're using that to study the health of the large blood vessels in the neck and in the heart that end up supplying the brain. So sort of doing a bit of heart imaging as well, and then trying to link those two types of imaging methods to get a sort of holistic picture of what's going on with this heart-brain link.
So who are the people that you would be subjecting that to? Who are the research subjects for that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're starting out with sort of a normal elderly population, so a wide range of cognitive presentations, but also people who've had histories of heart disease, diabetes, and all of the other sort of vascular lifestyle risk factors for dementia, but not people who have dementia just yet. So we're hoping to first establish some sort of associations or see if there are any associations within this group, and then move on to a more clinical population in the coming years.
So, and would that be people with different types of, because of course, I can't help but think about the links between this and whether you're thinking about vascular dementia particularly, because of course we know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is one would go straight to vascular dementia, but there is such a large overlap in the risk factors and the clinical presentations and the underlying pathology for both Alzheimer's and vascular dementia now that, we're seeing more and more cases of mixed dementia where the diagnosis is a little bit blurred. And so I think that what we would like to do eventually is to scale this up in populations of both Alzheimer's as well as vascular dementia.
And I guess, what are you expecting to find? I mean, are you expecting to find that better blood flow to the brain will improve, and so exercise more? I mean, tell me what.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the key things, and the reason why this is so interesting to me, is that a lot of the blood flow changes to the brain, they're not permanent. And so we can reverse them there are some very preliminary findings to show that exercise, as you just mentioned, can increase blood flow to the brain. And, so impairments in blood flow can be modified and targeted really early on in life so that we can maintain this sort of reserve, as we've talked about earlier, to sort of offset the later sort of cognitive decline that may come. And so, if we can show that there is some sort of association and that people who have these risk factors also have impairments in blood flow, then maybe targeting these risk factors through exercise or sort of modifying lifestyle can help maintain that blood flow and brain health as we get older.
And I suppose, is it likely, do you think, that the effect is going to be over long-term, over the long-term reduction of blood flow to the brain, as opposed to somebody had a long period of, say, ill health or something like that impacted that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're still not very clear whether it's sort of these small bursts of large impairments of blood flow, or whether they're sort of sustained, very sort of chronic changes in blood flow over the lifespan that may help, that may cause some of the changes that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And so, what my study is doing is looking at people over a really, really long period of time. So when they were starting from when they were in their 30s, they now have brain imaging scans when they're in their 70s. So we have lifespan worth of cardiovascular health data on them. And we can sort of trace back to see how their brain health when they were 70, how does that relate to their heart health when they're 30? And that can sort of give us a little bit more of a longitudinal story there.
Oh, that's exciting. So you've got access to longitudinal. So is this through something like the Dementia Platform UK?
Exactly. Or? So it's the Whitehall cohort, which in the UK, which is now part of the Dementias Platform UK as well. So we get access to this wealth of lifespan data, which is so unique and so rare for a researcher to get their hands on, that it really tells us a nice story about the lifespan rather than just a sort of snapshot in a time point in someone's life.
And these are people, as well as having, so only despite, because this is one of the challenges, isn't it? I guess, is if you want to do a longitudinal study now, the problem is if you recruit now, it's 30 years time before you're going to get the results,
exactly.
Which is so far away. So being able to start a study now that can hit the ground running, so to speak.
Absolutely, it's cost efficient, it's time efficient, it sort of ticks all the boxes really.
But I'm guessing none of this is perfect. There's still be information that you would have liked to have had that you haven't got.
Yeah, I think that's the case with any study where there's sort of retrospective data. You think, oh, I wish they had 30 years ago collected this one extra measurement, and but I think those you sort of trade off the positives and the downsides of it really.
So that's probably a timely moment to plug some of the longitudinal studies that we know are ongoing now, for example. So I'm thinking about the PROTECT study, which is out of King's and Exeter, which is Clive Barwell's study. I think there's a website called PROTECT, which you can sign up to, and they'll send you a genetic cheek swab through the post, and they have some online cognitive tests that they ask you to do regularly. This is a study that I think anybody over the age of 50, I want to say, can participate in now for the PROTECT study. Craig Ritchie, an academic from Edinburgh, has the PREVENT study as well, which is anybody over the age of 40 can participate in that, and they invite you in for an MRI every couple of years and take some spinal fluid from you if you'll donate that. Tim, is that because the PROTECT study is in Cambridge now as well? Is that something you're involved in? The PREVENT?
Yeah, it's not directly actually, no, but I've heard that there are definitely people here involved with PROTECT and PREVENT. And to be honest, to set up these kinds of studies now, it's a national effort. So you find that there's always someone just around the corner who's involved with one of these studies, which is great. And as I said earlier, people are so willing to share and put in the effort to to get the data and then share it and make it widely available. It's a real change in culture, I think, over the past sort of 15, 20 years to do that.
So the easiest way to, I mean, obviously you can go to their websites, but also anybody watching, if you sign up to Join Dementia Research, I know both those studies recruit through that website. So if you sign up to joindementiaresearch.nihr.ac.uk, it asks you some information when you sign up about your health, your age, your demographics. And then at the end of registering, it'll show you if you're eligible for any of the studies that are recruiting right now. And these are studies, you know, I'm over 40, I can say, and I think there are more studies for people over the age of 40 than younger people, perhaps. But do sign up anyway, because I think there are studies, and the participants for these, we're looking for people increasingly younger, because that's the demographic of people looking for. So
yeah,
Tim,
it's hard actually to recruit younger people generally than older people, because you know, people are retired, they have more time. So the younger population is more difficult. Yeah.
We have got a question which I think is probably one for you, Tim.
Yeah, do you want me to answer that? Yeah.
Chris asks, is imaging still the gold standard of diagnosis for dementia, or is there an alternative accurate diagnostic method, perhaps one less resource or time intensive?
Yeah, so to be honest, imaging has never been a gold standard for dementia diagnosis. The diagnosis is what we call a clinical diagnosis, really. So that's talking to the patient, doing some memory and thinking tests, and seeing from that information, you know, examining the patient. What do we think the diagnosis is then? The main role traditionally for imaging has been to rule out some other cause of memory or thinking problems. So has there been a stroke? Has there been a brain tumor, something like that? So it's actually only relatively recently, I mean, Nick Fox at UCL really sort of kicked off the idea that you can look at the hippocampus in Alzheimer's disease particularly, and see if that's shrunk and whether that's you know, associated with Alzheimer's disease, which it does seem to be. But actually, it's not good enough to tell you that's your diagnosis. And the question also asks about PET scans and post-mortem. So yeah, if you want a definite diagnosis of dementia, the only way is to take a bit of your brain out and look at it under a microscope. Most of my patients, strangely, don't go for that option.
No, not if they're hoping for treatment. But I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, again, NHS care services vary. I know some NHS services, an MRI scan is part of the, it is usually does go along with it, whether that's to verify or to have another look or to see. But yeah, some places do an MRI scan routinely and others don't.
Yeah, well, we've just started a study here in Cambridge called Quantitative MRI in the NHS Memory Clinics, or QMIN-MC for short. And anyone who comes through here who needs a scan, we get them over the road to our research scanner, and we get some of these sort of fancy scans so that we can see, well, if you do a more fancy scan, do you get more information? And can you, rather than just saying, oh, well, we're doing the scan to make sure you haven't had a stroke, can we actually say, well, we can use the scan in a more positive way and say, well, this is pointing towards a specific diagnosis. I know there's people in Oxford doing the same. Actually, I'm trying to arrange a meeting at the moment with some people in Oxford so that we can sort of work on that together. And there's a few other memory clinics around the country doing the same sort of thing. So I think we can start to use imaging in a cleverer, better way, using some of these
absolutely
methods.
And then using the data you've got as well. I mean, to as you know, research information, and it's all right. But I guess it comes back to the cost. Scans. Yeah. I don't know, what's the scan cost, Tim?
Yeah, it's about, I think it's 320 quid on the NHS. That's the sort of tariff for an MRI scan. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of money, but it's still, you know, a lot of people. So we reckon from Cambridgeshire we could potentially recruit 10,000 people a year to have an MRI scan. So it's a lot of people, and you multiply that across the country. But you know, people need a scan anyway. So if you're going to do it, why not do it properly? Because you save then on people coming backwards and forwards to clinic appointments, having extra expensive things like PET or lumbar punctures, which are invasive. But if you can do it properly with an MRI scan, I think that, you know, make a more definite diagnosis early on. I think that would be beneficial actually and worth the cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember, it's the AAIC conference, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, a couple of years ago now, looking at a study that looked at the proportion of people whose diagnosis was changed if they were given an MRI along with their later on.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of people's diagnosis was changed if it came with if they had an MRI retrospectively compared to not.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean,
I can't remember who it was. I mean, this is a couple of years ago now, but
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think you just want, as a clinician, I want all the information that I can get, to be honest. And then I just it's like putting together a lot of jigsaw pieces. You know, the scan won't give me a diagnosis. The cognitive test on its own won't give me the diagnosis. The lumbar puncture won't give me the diagnosis. I've got to put all that with the history and just sort of work out, well, does this look like Alzheimer's disease or something else? You know,
make
so
that
it's a puzzle.
That big guesswork that you talked about right back at the start, the brain making its
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're out of time and our next guest has arrived. Thank you very much. Good luck in setting up your new lab, Sana. It sounds
thank you very
really
much.
interesting work. I live in Oxford, so if you're looking for an old bloke with multiple risk factors, I'm your man.
Thanks very much, Adam.
Yeah, thanks so
More
much,
power
Adam.
to you. You're still going strong. Well done.
Yeah,
thank you.
Keep it up.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tim Rittman, Dr. Sana Suri. Thank you very much for both joining us today. Keep up the good work. Thank you.